Oke, selamat malam para hadirin sekalian. Kembali Teolog Awam Indonesia mengudara. Pada malam hari ini kami membahas topik yang cukup panas dan menyenangkan, yaitu mengenai church leaver atau orang-orang yang meninggalkan gereja. Dan hari ini kami dari Teolog Awam, saya tidak sendiri, tapi juga ada kawan saya yang muncul pada umumnya, yaitu adalah Angga.
Halo.
Halo enggak?
Gimana Sam? Udah
Baik,
sehat?
baik. Udah sehat, udah lepas dari COVID. Dan hari ini kami nggak hanya berdua, tetapi juga ada Dr. Katie Cross yang akan mempresentasikan materinya mengenai church leavers tersebut.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hai.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about church leavers with Dr. Katie Cross. So I will introduce you a bit. Dr. Katie Cross is a lecturer at University of Aberdeen, practical theology, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah. And she did her research on these topics, church leavers. So that's why we invite Dr. Katie to talk with us and maybe share a bit. And then later on, we will have some discussions, and everyone of you, the audience, are welcome to join the discussions by putting comments on YouTube. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm in Scotland, which is very far away from where you are just now. And also, I'm in the past, so it's the middle of the day for me. And I was just saying before we started that I'm sorry I'm speaking English, and I hope that's not too much of a challenge for you, especially because I have a bit of a Scottish accent as well, because I'm in Scotland, I'm from Scotland, so we'll see how we get on. So theology for me is for everybody, right? And this is why I was really interested in talking to you, because I love what you're doing. I really like the idea that you're opening theology up for everyone to take part in it. I think that's really cool. So thank you for having me. This is really new research. So I've only just started on this. It's very new. It's right at the beginning. So I'm looking forward to talking about it because I'm still shaping it and I'm still trying to get a kind of handle on what I'm doing. So the context of this so far is the UK, where I'm from, where I live and work. And I know that church leavers are not just in the UK, so I am interested to hear what you have to say about that as well. But let me tell you about where I'm from, first of all, a bit of my background. So in the UK, what we have at the moment is religion is just on a downturn. It's going away a lot more than it has in the past. And if we listen to people who are sociologists talking about this, they say it's in terminal decline, which means not only is it going down, but it's going to keep going down and it might never recover. So people like Steve Bruce, he actually works at the same university as me, would say we're in terminal decline. But at the same time, we've got people like Grace Davey, she is another sociologist, and she says this is actually a really white Western way of thinking about religion. Because if we zoom out and we look at the whole world, about 84% of people worldwide actually do have some kind of contact with a religion. So I think this is a Pew Research study that was done a few years ago, says the amount of people who have this contact with religion is huge. And that, to talk about the UK as the only indicator of how religion is working, that's not fair because it leaves out much of the world. So we don't want to do that. But my question is, a lot of people are leaving church. So where do they go? And what do they do when they leave? And who helps them? What do they talk about? There hasn't been a whole lot of research done on this. There's been a little bit, but not too much. So I'm interested in doing more research, and I'm interested in talking about three things just to start off with, which I'll kind of move on to talk about today. So one is this idea of stages of faith. So the idea that our faith doesn't stay static. It actually changes and moves around. I want to talk about the story of Job because that comes up in some of the literature that I've read, and also this idea of wilderness. I call it a paradigm, that's just a fancy academic word, but the idea of wilderness has been quite important for church leaders as well. So that's what I'm going to do. Just to let you know that the boundaries of this, again, the UK at the moment, but not necessarily only the UK, as the research kind of carries on. So I'm excited to hear about what you're doing in Indonesia, if this resonates with you at all as well. And at the moment, I'm looking at mostly established churches, so Church of Scotland, Church of England, those kinds of churches. Partly because there hasn't been a lot of research on them, it's more charismatic churches. The other issue that we have is the data. So census data and numbers. First of all, I'm not good at numbers. I'm really bad with maths and numbers. But also the data moves really slowly. So when we gather people's ideas through census data, in particular, it takes a lot of time to gather that and process it. So I'm working on kind of limited data. And then using sociology as well. So I use quite a lot of sociology because it's helpful. It gives us a picture and a background to just kind of understand what people believe and think. And I've said this already, but I'll say it again. This is really new research. So I'm right at the beginning and I want to expand a lot more. So get some more evidence. That's the plan. But I haven't done that yet. So in the UK, I don't know how much you will know about this, but we have quite a big number of people who actually don't attend church and have no religion, which is quite strange for the UK because previously it had been, you know, historically it's quite a religious place, but not anymore. So the British Social Attitude Survey, this was from a few years ago now, says that over half of people have no religion in the UK. And so when people are asked, they say, I have no religion, I have nothing. And this has increased quite a lot in the past few decades. I always think the 1980s are not that far away, and then I remember it's 2022, and this is quite a long time ago now. What's funny is, I was going to say, I don't know how old you are, but in the 18 to 24-year-old bracket, more people say that they have no religion. So the younger you are, the more that tends to be true, which is interesting as well. So the issue with all of this is sociologists are looking at this and some of them are saying, well, it looks like we're stuck. It's going in one direction and it isn't going to change. So we're in terminal decline right now of churches and of belief and practice. And Steve Bruce, who I've spoken about before, he uses these big fancy academic words to describe what's going on. So I'll explain what they mean. Rationalization. So this is where we take these sort of supernatural beliefs about God and we replace them with more kind of scientific beliefs. So science replacing religion. Rational scientific ideas, religious pluralism is another one, and diversity. He says it's really good for the movement of people around immigration and movement, but not so good for keeping specific religious ideas and customs, because if you move country, you might not keep all of the customs that you're used to. And he also says that technology causes humans to kind of think differently as well. What was the other one I missed? Structural differentiation. That's just a fancy way of saying churches are now in competition with other institutions. So it used to be that we got all of our meaning from the church, but now in the UK there are lots of other places that we can learn about the world and get our meaning from. So fancy words, but basically what he's saying is religion is going away. and there's not much we can do about it. But actually, that's not true. So it's more complex than that, I would say. Here's a little bit of evidence. Linda Woodhead, who is a sociologist, she talks about religious nuns. So these are people who don't have any religion, but they also wouldn't say that they're atheist either, right? So they kind of sit in the middle somewhere. And she says over 50% of people in the UK call themselves religious nuns. So I wonder, I'm really interested to hear if there's anybody in Indonesia who would relate to this label, or if it's quite a limited label and it's maybe only just for people who are in the UK. So that's quite complex. She also is building on some of her other work she did in the 1990s with Paul Helas, and that was on spiritual, she called it a spiritual revolution. So this idea of being spiritual but not religious, I don't know if that's one that you've maybe heard of before. So the idea that people don't have a religion, but they might do yoga or some kind of rituals, new age rituals, mindfulness, meditation, astrology, zodiac, that's quite popular. And also, Grace Davie says religion isn't just people going to church. So it's more than that. She says it's about believing. Even when people don't belong to a church, it's about believing whatever they believe. So she has this idea of believing without belonging. She also talks about vicarious religion, big words that mean things about human behavior, but vicarious religion for Grace Davie, that is where people kind of attend church when they want to. So Christmas, maybe Easter, important times of the year. But for her, she says religion's private because historically we had to go, we had to attend church. It was like an obligation, we had to be there, we were expected to go, but now that's not the case. And we have a bit more choice, so we can choose whether or not to go. So for her, what she's saying is church leavers might not attend church, but they might still adhere, they might still believe in Christianity. So that's an interesting thing to think about. So what on earth happens now? Where do church leavers fit? So if they're done with church but not belief, that's quite interesting. That means that we might be seeing people leave churches but not stop believing in God. Alan Jameson, I'll talk about him a little bit more. He's done some research on this and he calls church leavers duns. So they leave because they're done with faith. And he says they're different to nuns because nuns have no faith, no belief. And then at this stage, what I haven't thought about is deconstruction. So the idea of like ex-evangelicals, I think you've talked about this before, all this sort of thing. That's not something that's come up for me yet, but I think it will relate to what I'm doing. And the other thing that I have to think about is COVID, right? So all of us, no matter where we are in the world, we've all been affected by COVID-19. And I'm really interested in the idea that churches here, especially in the UK, had to move online. So what is the impact of that on people wanting to go to church or not go to church anymore? We actually don't know yet. It's not been long enough. We don't have the data on that at the moment. So I have a few questions. We can talk about these together. These are questions from my research. What do church leaders tell us about faith now in 2022? What do they tell us, especially in somewhere like the UK, where the church is less influential? What do they tell us about people's attitudes towards religion? I'm also interested in the pastoral side of this because a lot of people leave church for reasons that are quite traumatic or difficult. So what are the reasons that people leave? What are the issues that they have when they do leave? And how can we look after people who want to not be in church anymore. And I'm also interested to find out if I can kind of chart people's experiences. I want to know what people have experienced and whether or not that will help others. So is there a kind of blueprint that we can turn to? So those are some questions briefly. So I'm going to go through 3 sort of themes on church leaving that we can discuss in more detail if we want to. So I won't give you too much detail just now, and then maybe we can talk about them afterwards. And the first of these comes from the work of someone called James Fowler, and it's the model of faith maturation that he has. It's called the stages of faith. And I don't know that it fits absolutely everybody who has faith. That's maybe one criticism of his work. But he has these 7 faith stages, which you can see on the screen. They start with primordial, undifferentiated, ending in universalizing enlightenment. Again, it's just a lot of big words, really. That's what academics like. But basically, each is a stage where you move through it at some point in your faith journey. So you move from kind of soaking it all up as a child, where you're learning from other people, and then you kind of formalize what you think religiously. Then you might struggle, you might have doubts, you might have kind of back and forth ideas. Maybe you'll have a faith crisis. I don't know, depends. And sometimes, some people, but not everybody, they settle on a stage of enlightenment. So that's quite rare, he says, not everybody does. But basically, he says, faith is not linear. It's not something we can predict necessarily how we're going to feel about any of this. So because of this, I started to think, well, it kind of sounds like what Fowler is describing as something that we know within the Christian tradition already. So Saint Teresa of Avila, I don't know if you've heard of her, but her Christian journey, she talked about the progression through the rooms of an interior castle. I quite like the idea of the interior castle. And she says each step of that faith journey brought her closer to God. So she likes to think of it in that way. St. John of the Cross, he talks about the dark night of the soul. So releasing this kind of spiritual baggage and trying to, again, move closer to God. 2 more, so John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress, that's all about knowledge and journeying in faith, so not standing still, not being static. And then Hannah Hunard's book, Hind's Feet on High Places, that's quite a new one to me, but it's about a character who it sort of emphasizes the highs and lows of her faith. So what's really interesting is in James Fowler's stages of faith, he never talks about church. So he doesn't mention church. So all of this is happening regardless of what our church attendance is like. So I think that's really interesting. Okay, quickly. The story of Job. So we know the story of Job, most of us, the Book of Job. And Alan Jameson, he's a New Zealand-based theologian, and he did quite a lot of sustained work on church leavers, but from a more charismatic perspective. And he brings up the Book of Job, and he basically talks about how usually we think of Job as a book where there's a lot on lament and suffering and distress, but he uses Job to talk about how faith can become kind of dislocated or unpicked, or it can change. So what he says is that Job's friends try to remind him of what the correct beliefs and teachings are in his community of faith. But actually, Job really struggles, and he can't believe in the same way anymore. He can't accept these ideas, so he doesn't. And then he has this sort of struggle where he goes through a kind of transformation. He has a face-to-face encounter with God, and that is his dark night of the soul. And he has to come to an awareness, both of himself and of others. And what's interesting about this is there's no resolution, right? God doesn't explain why Job was suffering. He just God just sort of leaves Job, and Job is sat there questioning. So there's no explanation for this. But Job is humbled by the experience that he has. And this relates, Jameson says, to church leavers, because church leavers come to kind of realize God's presence outside the boundaries of what they might have thought. So we might think that God can only exist in church. What Job realizes is God is bigger. God is more mysterious than we thought before. And so Alan Jameson says that's quite comforting for people who are leaving church. And so lastly, this is one that I've come up with myself. I've done some initial research into this kind of wilderness idea. So this is the idea that when you leave the church, it's a bit like wandering in the wilderness on your own, far away from the community, far away from people. And when we think about wilderness, I mean, I don't know, do you have a lot of wilderness in Indonesia? A little bit? Maybe? Not so much.
Well, we live in the city, so.
Yeah, I was going to say in Scotland we have like just so much land that nobody lives on, and it's really remote, and we have islands and parts of the north of our country that's really just very quiet. Just imagine this place that no one's there, and you're wandering in this place. And when we think about wilderness, we normally think kind of negatively about it. Like, it's not a nice place. It's a place of abandonment, solitude. You're removed from the community, so you're not with other people. And actually, the Merriam-Webster, this is a dictionary definition, says that a wilderness is a tract or region uncultivated and uninhabited by human beings, an empty or pathless area, wild or uncultivated mass, or a confusing or bewildering situation. So I'm thinking also of the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years. That was a wilderness event. But for them, the wilderness was a punishment from God. God was like, right, you're not listening to me, Israelites, so you will wander in the desert for 40 years. So we don't think of wilderness as being a good thing generally. But in the case of the Israelites, in the wilderness, God doesn't actually leave them alone. God has a continued presence with the Israelites and continues to guide them. So even though we think of wilderness sometimes as being actually quite a kind of a negative space, maybe would be the way to describe it. In the Christian tradition, wilderness actually can mark different stages of faith, can give us space for new encounters, and it can give us space for meaning as well. So a couple of examples of this. Let's go to Jesus first of all, good place to start. So Jesus led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Now, we're in a period of Lent just now, so this is what we think about during Lent, is Jesus and his ministry and the things that he did. And Jesus is led into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And Alan Jameson says this is really interesting when you're thinking about church leavers, because wilderness time too was part of God's leading. So in other words, God doesn't just have Jesus out in the community. There are times when Jesus retreats from people as well. And then secondly, John the Baptist, he chose the wilderness to begin his ministry, so the wilderness of Judea. And he chose that on purpose, a really inhospitable place, really difficult to survive in. But that didn't prevent him from growing his faith and from preaching and from prophesying as well. So that's John the Baptist. Elijah has two wilderness moments, one in 1 Kings 17 and the other in 1 Kings 19. And the first time Elijah is sent to the wilderness, even when he's being faithful to God, the second time he runs away to the wilderness because his life is at risk, but God still goes and finds him and brings him back. So interestingly for Elijah, the wilderness is both a place of encounter, but it's also a place where he runs away but God goes with him. So God doesn't leave him in the wilderness place. So interestingly, what we're finding is wilderness doesn't mean removal from God. So if church leavers are thinking about wilderness space and the idea of wandering on their own or being alone, it's actually not a place where God abandons them. It's a place where they can actually still encounter God. Okay, just to kind of finish, what I want to do next is I'm doing a qualitative research study. So that just means I'm talking to people who have left the church. Want to do more of that. The problem that I have is that people don't present themselves in a community of church leavers. So it's quite tricky to find them. So lots of questions about how to think through those issues, cultural patterns, sociology. Obviously, again, back to care for people who have left, want to make sure that they're well looked after. And what are the different expressions of faith that people might have when they're not in church. And then lastly, different demographics. What are the experiences minority groups? What are the experiences outside of the UK? Right. So this is why I'm really interested to speak to you, because I'm pretty sure that we're not the only place that has church leavers. And lastly, I think this is a really good place to end, is that Alan Jameson says what people leaving church need is time, space, resources, understanding, validation, and support. So actually, when people leave church, we need to be understanding of them and not judge them too quickly. Okay, that's me.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
presentation, Katie. It's amazing.
Thank you for listening.
Very, very interesting, I think. Well, yeah. I guess I'll comment a bit. The different context we have in Indonesia compared to UK.
Yeah.
And maybe also US, because I saw a lot of research about this in the US.
Mhm.
I think the main difference is, as we talked before, that in Indonesia, it's very uncommon for people to be an atheist.
Yeah.
I think, declaring yourself to be nuns is actually kind of bad, because we are a country based on it's based on belief in God first and foremost, and in our constitutions. I think the national constitution. So it is required for everyone to have religion. Even in our ID card, it will be like written, "What's your religion?"
Yeah.
So I think, and from my, at least some will add to this, but at least from my experience, even at the time when I was an atheist, I never really declare it to my parents and everyone. You just be one, even when you go to church. And from my experience, a lot of my friend church, and that's true. COVID is a very, very game changer, because people don't need to go to church. They don't really need to, nobody knows whether you attend church or not, and a lot of them, who I know, no longer interested with the church, or maybe dons. I think it's a very interesting concept. They actually, I have a lot of friends who I would say, if we are in the Western country, they'll be the nuns. And maybe one also, I don't think Indonesia has or will ever go through the phase of what the Western call secular world, right? We haven't reached that part yet. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. It's really wonderful presentations. I really love the wilderness concept. I think it's really beautiful, and I think it's really relate for a lot of people out there. I mean, it doesn't mean those who leave church. I believe those who leave church still has some memories of the church, and even a relationship with God. But yeah, I really love the wilderness. That's wonderful. So I'm gonna add something from Anga. So I also believe that the secularism thesis it's not working here in Indonesia, at least in majorly. So Indonesia is a really big country from Sumatra Island to Papuans, and our I think religion, even in our, what is it? In our, what is Pancasila? What is Pancasila?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. What's Pancasila? It's like our
dasar ideologies, our ideology. Even in our ideology, one of the
the first one is we believe in God.
Yeah, we believe in the one God. We believe in one God. So yeah, secularism won't work in Indonesia, but it will make problem then, because a lot of people who considered as, maybe just like what Angga said, the dons and the nuns and some other types of those who live church will be marginalized, and not only marginalized by the church, but even by the society, and that's make them real. It will be very hard for them, because everyone will throw the stones to them, and that makes the life of those who left the church, or maybe some people will consider them as left religion, will be really hard, and I think it will be interesting. It will be interesting to, just like what you said, and I think it's in the last slides, yeah, that it's still, the church still needs to be there for them. The church still need to be there for them, because well, the society won't be there for them. Then who else? And the church is the only people, groups of people that may take care of them. So really totally agree with that. I have a question, Katie. So I wonder, I wonder how about this church live, how the church in UK, what kind of perspective the church in UK have towards them, the church livers. I mean, is it more like negative, or is it something like, well, it's happening, so yeah, it's just like normal usual day, or they have that you know well, yeah, what kind of the way the church perceives them that live the church. So yeah, thank you for the presentation, and that's my questions that pop ups into my mind, because in Indonesia, not only the group of the church, but also the society will hate them.
Yeah, and that's so. I mean, it's so interesting. I think when we first talked about this, the idea of the danger of leaving church that there might be in your context is not something that we would experience here. So you can leave the church in the UK. People might be saying things about you. I don't know, depends. Churches don't interact with people who leave. They don't tend to. They don't really have a good way of speaking about it. So when people leave, it's like they were never there, which is not good, because it matters that people were present in churches. So either what they do is I think they would look at it negatively, not quite in the same way as it would be in Indonesia, but it would be quite negative, depending on the denomination as well, or what the church was like, or it would just be ignored, maybe, and they just wouldn't engage with it. So I think this is a problem, because people need help, they need support, right? So if they leave, I think we still need to look after them. We can't just say, oh, right, goodbye, leave. I think as church, we're supposed to care for everybody. So when your belief changes, you should still be looked after. And if you don't want to be in church, I think churches should ask, why don't you want to be here? What is it? Have we done something? Could we do better? I think is a question that churches should be asking, but they're not. It's not happening. So that does need to happen, I think. That's a good question,
though. I have a kind of follow-up question from Sam's question.
Yeah.
I wonder how the church, you do research on Church of England and Church of Scotland. Are there any like convictions that affect church leavers? Because At least I don't know, Sam. At least for me, I think Sam. As I speak for myself. Like there are some considerations of leaving my church, for example,
Yeah.
but not necessarily leaving the church per se, but looking for a church that can cater my belief, for example. Because in Indonesia, mostly from what I observed, the churches are fairly, I'd say, kind of fundamentalist mostly. Evangelicalism is very, very prominent in Indonesia. So it would be really hard for somebody to have questions and different understanding of the faith and going to this particular church because they'll be seen as some kind of a threat, you know. And I think this kind of like very, very rigid dogmatics caused a lot of people leaving the church because they feel they cannot belong to the church if they don't believe in these sets of beliefs. I wonder what in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the sense I have from church leavers that I've spoken to already is that people do try different churches sometimes, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just leave. And it is, I think the challenging thing about it is it's so personal. It seems to be such a personal kind of thing that people go through. Most of the research that's been done has been done on charismatic churches. So kind of maybe more what you're used to in Indonesia. But there hasn't been as much on established churches here. I think that's because people expect that people will leave those churches now because of all the other stuff that's happening, because we're secularizing. I don't think we're secularizing in a linear way, but because we're secularizing, people just expect that everyone will leave. And so we don't question it. We just kind of say, oh, well, right, okay. That's like, well, there's quite a lot to be done. We need to be thinking about this. So what do people do? I mean, some do attend churches where their belief lines up a bit more, and some just leave, I think, is what I'm finding so far. But I'll let you know if anything changes and I discover a good answer, I'll let you know.
Yeah. So you have something to add, or?
Yeah. Someone's asked the questions on YouTube. Can we just refer to the questions, Angga?
Oh yeah.
I think 3 questions, gitu.
Oh yeah. Thank you for the enlightenment, Katie. I have a question. From your research, usually who are the people that leave the church the most? Are they have the same quality, background, age group, and for what kind of reasons the most?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Thank you for your question. So I'm at the start of the research. So at the moment, I don't have a lot of information on the kind of themes or the ideas that people have reasons for leaving. But I do know that Alan Jameson has done some work on this already. So I'll probably be looking into his work a little bit. So he talks about different kinds of leavers. Some people, he says, are just really angry. He calls them disillusioned followers, right? He says they're angry, they're really hurt by specific things that have happened in the church. So could be a particular theology or something that's happened to them personally. And then he says there's also people who are a bit more kind of reflective. So they continue their faith, they continue to hold on to doctrine. And it might be that they have maybe a crisis with faith or something personally happens to them, whatever. He says there are also people who are looking, I think Angga just asked this, like people who are looking for new faith journeys, who want to try and own their faith and go to a place where their beliefs line up with the church. So that's another kind of group. And then he says there's other people who are kind of critically examining their faith, right? And they're in maybe a transitional phase, so they might leave the church completely or they might not. So my thought is, once I start to really get into the research, either what I find is going to match this, or it's not. And I think it might be a bit more complicated than just putting people into 4 categories. So that's what he does. He says 4 categories of people. I'm like, I don't think people fit 4 categories. I think there's probably a bit more diversity to it. Also, he wrote this quite a long time ago, so about 20 years ago, I think, almost. So I have a feeling that things have changed, and I also have a feeling that people who are leaving are kind of, I don't know, I'd say 30s, 40s upwards. Younger people just aren't having contact with the church in the same way, for all the reasons that we've talked about. That's a really good question. That's one I'll keep in mind, I think, as I'm researching. Thank you for that.
And this is a very, very interesting questions that I don't think you'll find in the UK, but it will happen in Indonesia. How about Kristen KTP? It's KTP is our ID card that we have to put our religion in our ID card. Because we have
in UK or is in UK you put religion in your ID card or not?
No, nothing like that. No.
Yeah.
The only time actually, I was going to say the only time we ever answer anything about our religion, we actually this week we're doing a census, so we're actually like collecting information about people's religious beliefs, and I can't remember any other time when I've been asked about my religious beliefs publicly like that. So and even then you don't have to tell anybody, you can do it privately, so no one needs to see.
Yeah. So how about this phenomena? You look religious outside, have an identity, but you don't believe in God anymore. But it's so hard to live as an atheist, so you don't confess.
Oh, that must be so difficult. That must be so hard. And it's something I think must be really, really, I think, personally challenging to live like that, to have to do that. So yeah, my question back to you is, can you tell me how that is? Like, how do you what are people's experiences of living as atheists in Indonesia when you're also declaring yourself as a Christian? Tell me, educate me.
Well, yeah. I lived from, I think, junior high and high school. High school until I worked until 2018. I'm 30 years old, like right now, so it was around 17 to 27, and it was, I don't know, I went to church every week at a time. I skip sometimes, so I don't want to go, but I still go, and I don't believe what the preachers say. I think it's just become a norm, even though you hated it so much, but you have to do it because you don't have a choice. Because the social pressure is just, I think, as a Christian, if you don't go to church on Sundays, at least in my community, that looks bad. Because even at schools, because I went to Christian schools, so we were expected to write a report of every week as part of school assignment. What did you listen on Sundays? And so the system is shaped as such that they don't have a choice as than going to the church or to any belief that you go to. So I think it's very unique conditions that you will never find in the UK.
Yeah, that's very, very different. So the question then I have for you is, can you leave the church? Can you actually leave in Indonesia or no? Is it difficult to leave?
Yeah.
When you're leaving the church, it's not your own individual problem, but it's also your family's problems, your wider family's problems, your friends and everyone's
your
problems.
Friends.
So yeah, that's why it's really hard to live the church.
We're not talking about leaving the church to be an atheist, but even if I leave my denominations and move to another denominations, that's an issue.
Yeah. So I think that's such a good question, because you are so tied in socially to your church, your family, your friends, all of this. In the UK, that's not the case at all, because we do have this idea of structural differentiation, which is just a fancy way of saying we don't just have the church, but we have other things that people use to make meaning. And we have other activities that we do on a Sunday, right? So if you don't go to church, nobody's going to be like, oh, scandalous. If you're not at church, people assume you're watching football. If you're in Scotland, watching sport on the TV. I'm thinking of my dad. My dad does laundry on a Sunday. Like we do other things, and it's less of a issue. But having said that, I think that Alan Jameson in his work found some of the more conservative or charismatic churches where church does become your whole centre, right? So in a church like the Church of Scotland, which is where I'm from, your whole life isn't built around the church. It's just a part of your life, but it's not where you go every day. If you're in a more charismatic tradition, it might be that you build your social life, your friendships, your socializing, your identity around the church. And then you would have a more similar phenomenon to Indonesia, even though it's in the UK. Although it would still be quite different, because even if you left a church like that, it's not illegal to be an atheist, right? So even then, people are, no one's coming after you,
Yeah, and another thing that will happen if you're a self-proclaimed atheist online, Indonesian netizen considered as one of the rudest netizens in the world. So
really,
yeah, you'll surprise what happened with your social media. I think that's happened in sometimes. So yeah, it's really dangerous here to be an atheist in Indonesia. So that's why, just like Juan Francisco said here, well, it's so hard to live to be an atheist in Indonesia. And that's why I said the secularism thesis, it's not applicable here in Indonesia, but only some minor area, like just like what we discussed before, people who already in it's like wait I lost. Oh, someone said in Indonesia it is better to be a bad Christian than an atheist. Yeah. So sorry, I lost my train of thoughts. But anyways, that's what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm learning so much from all of you telling me about this, because I think what sociologists and theologians in the UK they have a tendency, I'll count myself, we have a tendency to think that just because something is happening with religion in our country, that must be what's happening in every country. That's a really British way to think, isn't it? It's such a British way to think, is to say, oh, well, because we have this experience, it must be everyone's experience, but it's not. But it must be really difficult, because this is the opposite of the church leaving, where people leave the church. They believe still in God, but they don't belong to a church. Whereas this is like belonging to the church without believing in God. So this is like the opposite thing, isn't it? And that's a really interesting way of describing it. It's better to be a bad Christian than an atheist. That's fascinating, but that must be so difficult for people. It must be really hard.
And so there are also some phenomena where people stay in the church, but they don't actually feel that they belong in the church. So that this kind of feeling that you are belong to a community, but you don't actually feel that you are belong there, but you can't leave the church. So it's just kind of different.
This sounds like something, I don't know if anyone's listening who'd be interested in this. It sounds like something we need to study. And I would say that because I am somebody who likes to study these things, but it does sound like something that is really particular to that context. And it would be something to research or to find out more about, because that does seem to be a really, difficult experience for people.
Katie, I want to ask about the theological framework that you use to describe these nones and don'ts. I wonder. So, what do you think? What do you think should the church look at these people of dones and nones? What is ideally, or how should ideally they look at these dones? I wonder what you think about it.
That's a really good question. So a lot of people who have written on this topic before, they write about it in a missional way. So what they would say is, we need to attract these people back to church. I don't agree, because sometimes the problem is the church itself, right? Sometimes the problem is the community, or it is the culture, maybe, of the church that has caused somebody a problem. So very, very often when people leave church, it's not actually about the beliefs. It's not about belief in God. It's not about disagreeing with the gospel message at all. It's just about the experiences that they've had in church that are not, they're just not good experiences sometimes. So the question I think to ask of churches is like, what have you done? What has your part been in people leaving? I think some introspection. So a bit of reflection on, what have we done? Has it been a problem? Is there a systemic issue? Sometimes there's not. Every church has somebody who just gets grumpy and leaves, and that's fine. And that's okay. But what I'm worried about is people who leave because there's a particular, so I do a lot of trauma theology as well. That's another thing that I do. So if there's been a particular trauma or a particular issue that the church hasn't helped with, I think they should be thinking, what can we do to be better? Rather than just, how do we get this one individual person to come back? Just to up our numbers or whatever. It needs to be about, what can we improve? And you know what? The church is really bad at doing that. And I say the church as a whole, but lots of different denominations are really bad at doing that. So yeah, we need to be thinking about how we can reflect on how we treat people, basically.
Now that you raise out about the trauma aspect, it becomes, I think, for me, really, really interesting, because the reactions that the church usually have whenever are critics, I guess, or like attacks, right, from the nuns and from the dons, is most of the time will be defensive, trying to make justification about what they've done. And I remember that you have a question, how about what to do? What do church leavers tell us about faith? And you relate it with the post-modern culture, for instances. So, for instance, Indonesia, for quite recently, it talks about postmodern is a thing in churches, and they view it as an opposing imminent danger that coming to the church. And also cases like LGBTQ, where recently there are some, I think, influencers who came out and tried to fight for the rights. Like, we're not saying whether the church should agree or disagree, but the fact that are people who actually like declaring themselves to be LGBTQ and still perceiving themselves as faithful to Christianity, to God, that also met with some very, very harsh and straight like dogmatism approach. So I think that's one problem about church and trauma, how dealing with people,
That's really difficult. And yeah, I think in that context where leaving is not okay or socially acceptable, that's really, really difficult to kind of move yourself away from that narrative, isn't it? And just to kind of push back on that and question. And that's worrying. And I think it's worrying not just in your context, but in my context as well. Like, people should be able to question and ask, because church is a human thing around God, right? So church isn't God. I think a lot of people forget that church isn't God, and they go, oh, like, we should, behave around church in a certain way. But I think we need to be careful about how we approach that. Yeah.
Katie, I'm sorry. Are we talking too much? I mean, we're really excited, so
no,
we just want to
no, this is so good. No, and actually, it's really, really helpful for me, because I'm learning so much from both of you. So I'm going to say,
we're really excited about this. So that's why we always tell you our stories. And is it possible for me to add something more about our context?
Please.
So
I love that.
Just like what you said, Angga said, it's oftentimes it's systemic problem, and what we, Angga I and Angga see here in Indonesia, it's also because of these. So the Christianity, not every Christianity that we have, but so many denominations here in Indonesia is things that we could say imported from United States, the evangelical faith. And the evangelical faith that's been in United States, usually we read Christian K. Dume book, Jesus and John Wayne, and I think that's also applicable in Indonesia, but it's changed. It's appropriated with our own idea of patriarchy, whether it's the Chinese, the Chinese Christians, and some other form of ethnicities in Indonesia. They are all patriarchal. So they are patriarchal, and and when we're talking about Chinese, those who believe in Confucianism, they believe in the strong hierarchy, a really strong hierarchy, and you need the great leader. So that's what happened in Indonesia. A lot of figures in Indonesia becoming the leader, and the structure, the hierarchy, it's really strong. So you will see a lot of I could say it's imbalance of power, and even abuse of power here in Indonesia, because the culture that we have, Confucianism and other ethnicities, which has this patriarchal ideas, but they justified it using some Bible verses, and that's how that's how it's makes some kind of trauma that Angga said. So they use the Bible to justify the cultural upbringings that they have, and we once part of we're Chinese, so Angga and I are both Chinese, and we're part of that church still until right now, and that's why it's really relatable for us.
That's so interesting, because I've read that book as well, and it's a really good book, a really, really interesting history, and it's funny because in America that's exactly the same, is it not? I mean, that's a lot of what Dume was saying in the book, is there is this kind of historical culture of just people kind of gathering around the church, and it is a really strongly patriarchal culture, and it remains a really strongly patriarchal culture. So that's a real problem, and this is why I think if I was doing this work in America, it would be quite different to doing it in the UK. And part of me is wondering if I have to do something like this, right? Samuel's like, yes, definitely, because there isn't just one way to leave the church, and that's exactly what you're explaining to me, is you can leave in your mind, or you can leave in ways that are not physically leaving, right? So you might not have the same ideas or the same thoughts anymore as people in your church. And so I think that's one thing I've maybe not considered yet, is people who, this is, I'm actually just thinking of this right now, is people who can't leave, or for some people it's not possible to leave. And I think that might be something, if you were going to look in the American context, particularly in more kind of fundamentalist churches, I think you would find that to be a problem as well. And I think Dume would say the same. So did you read this book, and did you find that there were similarities between what was said in the book and your situation?
Definitely.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
different.
Interesting. Tell me more, because that's fascinating. Were there specific ideas or things that you kind of picked up on?
Yeah, the complementarian stuff is something that really saleable here in Indonesia. It's because we also have that kind of understanding, our culture in Indonesia, and also the Chinese, that woman should be someone who serve her husband. That's happening in Indonesia, and it's everywhere in a lot of churches in Indonesia. The complementarian, it's really happening here.
Well, that's really similar to what Dume talks about. I mean, I was going to say I think we still have problems with patriarchal culture here in the UK and in Scotland. But as you might have guessed from my job and what I do, it's becoming less of an issue, which is really good. But we do still have those issues. But I think it is very, it's a lot more intense in the American context, it seems to be. And I don't know if that is sociologically tied to religion in some ways and tied to these religious ideas, which are funny because the early Christians didn't have these ideas. They've appeared from goodness knows where, but they've just appeared. And so we know, for example, that we had deaconesses and we had women who were involved pretty intimately in the early church, the running of the early church, and that was never a problem. And we think about, someone was saying to me recently about the disciples. One of my students asked me why Jesus only had male disciples. And I said to her, had you ever considered that the men had the most to learn? And that the women already kind of knew what was happening? And she's like, I'd never thought of that. And I was like, well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that's true, but I think, just to kind of flip it on its head and ask questions about that. And so I think theology is good when it helps us look at the way that our Christian practices have become. And then it asks, is that really what it means to be a Christian? To have those beliefs and ideas. And I would say it's difficult, and I do a lot of feminist theology, so it's very difficult when ideas about women become divorced from, for example, the work that Jesus did with women, which is pretty radical.
Yeah, I think for me at least, the problem is also because not all church and not all pastors in Indonesia, but at least in my community, they people simply just doesn't really do, I would say, contextual theologizing. That's why we just import things from the US, for example, and somehow it's just blends so well with the community, and so that's why it happens that way, I guess. And I don't know.
Because, yeah. I was going to say it's really interesting because it sounds like you have a really specific context, and you have your own history, right? And you have your own culture, and you have your own enormous country, and we can't just import from America all the time. We need to think about who we are as people without importing our theology from different countries. But it's difficult to do because it involves asking questions about our own context, which are sometimes quite uncomfortable questions. But of course, important. So yeah, I think what you're doing is amazing because you're asking those questions. And I was going to say I don't know as much about Indonesia, but I think talking about it at least, we start to think about like what's going on in your context, what's actually happening where you are.
And that's why if we say for younger generations the church is no longer relevant, if you imagine if the church simply imports something from the States without appropriating to the country, how could it be relevant for them?
Well, exactly, and goodness me, where does some of the theology in the States even come from? I mean, it comes from such a strange mixture of white supremacy and patriarchal culture, and also like Puritanism as well. So it's this weird mixture of ideas that's kind of come together to form this sort of theological Frankenstein. And actually, it's interesting you say that it's been imported where you are, because I think there are some churches in the UK that do import this kind of ideology as well. And they use the songs and the liturgies and the ideas that come from churches in the US. I just think we need to be able to do theology where we are, right? Because that's important. That's really important. We all have histories. All of our countries have, the UK has some pretty bleak history of colonizing and going around and forcing beliefs on most of the world. So I think we have to reckon with that. We can't just ignore that and say like, oh, we'll just import our ideas to a different country. I think we have to think critically about that, which seems to be what you're doing, which is really good. Difficult, but good.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna, like, Elia has a comment here. I think what Katie quotes from Jamison about what the believer need would work for Indonesia, where church becomes wilderness for some. But it's very interesting. The church becomes
That is-
wilderness for some.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I hadn't thought of the church. So thank you so much for that comment, because I hadn't actually thought of the church as wilderness. That's really, really interesting. I'm gonna think about that now, because that's really, really fascinating. That space within the church where we haven't left it, but we're on the edge of it, or we feel maybe like we're not having the same contact with it. But I mean, everybody needs time and space. We're not good if people have doubts. I think the first thing that happens in church, it's almost like a fire, isn't it? And people don't want the doubts to spread, so they just throw water on it, and they're just like, be quiet, don't speak. But what we need to ask people is, well, why? And let's give you some resources, right? And also, there are some people who just will not believe, and so we have to just care for them and not force it, right? I mean, I think it's good to be supportive, good to give people resources, good to understand them, but actually just to validate how they feel, right? So there might be some people who say, listen, I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I believe this. And rather than saying, right, leave, goodbye, you know, a lot of people's lives, as you're describing it in Indonesia, has been bound up in the church socially. So we need to give people space and support them. So that's one thing I'm really passionate about, is how do we look after people in a pastoral context when they leave. But that's a really good comment. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Katie, for your time. I think it's been a great discussions. We reached the 1 hour mark, and thank you so much for your time, for the amazing presentations and discussions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your questions as well, because this is such new research, and I think just knowing more about your stories and knowing about Indonesia is going to be really helpful for me going forward. So thank you so much for your time. It's been really good. It's been
You're welcome. Yeah, I hope this is not the last time. Maybe next time later on, after your research has developed, we can talk a bit more here. Because yeah, as you say, and what we're trying to do is to bring this to many people, you know, and it's not easy. It's quite hard, but yeah, this is what we do. So thank you.
Yeah, you're doing such a good job. So thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for your work as well, because it's so important that we have these discussions, and not just like in universities either, or in churches, but just for everybody. So it's really cool. Good luck.
Okay,
Keep
yeah,
going.
so okay, yeah, for everyone who's listening, thank you so much for your time, for your attention, and I think this is for today. Bye bye.